So, good afternoon. My name is Councillor Jeremy Pert, and I am the Cabinet Member for Communities and Health at Stafford Borough Council and the Deputy Leader. So, first of all, can I thank you for joining, apologies for that, for joining this afternoon's webinar and for giving up your time to do so. This is the third in a series of 6 webinars aimed at helping to have easier, knowledgeable conversations and feeling able to signpost people to the right support available within the borough, or to have valuable conversations. So this isn't about trying to persuade people to be specialists or experts in having those conversations, but be able to have some background knowledge to know how and where to signpost people to help the people within our communities. So today is the third of 6 webinars. Well, we have a further one tomorrow, and this afternoon's is all about preventing homelessness for those people who may be struggling to pay their rent. And I know that Hayley Smith, who is going to talk to us, who leads the housing options team within Stafford Borough Council. Hayley is going to talk to us and give us some top tips and try and offer some advice to help people identify the best ways forward. And I'm sure, Hayley, the first thing she would say is it's always best to talk to people involved, whether it's landlords or whether it's private rented landlords or social landlords, to make sure that people have those conversations early, because the earlier the conversations happen, the more options there are available. Anyway, after this afternoon's webinar, there's one with citizens' advice, which is going to look at the flip side of this equation, which is looking at budgeting and general advice, as well as signposting. Then we've got a slot booked with one of Hayley's colleagues, Chris Butcher from Housing Standards, which will talk about things like mould and damp issues. Given the seriousness of mould and damp on people's health, it's very easy for people to ignore mould and damp, particularly given the difficulties with the cost of living. But as I say, Chris will talk a bit more about some of those issues. And then our final webinar is with one of our long-standing partners who have helped put up the warm spaces, which is Midlands Partnership Foundation Trust, who will be talking a bit about their Staying Well service. So thank you to all our presenters. Thank you to all those people who are giving of their time and their commitment. As I said earlier, this is really about trying to provide some background information to people, and they're aimed at volunteers, support workers in the community, or maybe even some individuals directly who may be interested in what options are available to them. Although I guess the latter is less likely. The Warm Spaces network, which thank you to everyone who is involved in supporting Warm Spaces, is a partnership with a number of other organisations, which include Midlands Partnership Foundation Trust and the Community Foundation for Staffordshire. And I think the really interesting thing with Warm Spaces is that no one organisation could have put together the warm spaces across Stafford Borough on their own. So thank you to both the partners of Midlands Partnership Foundation Trust and the Community Foundation, as well as to everyone else who is involved in providing a warm space, a warm welcome and a warm drink and meal. The network, I think, is brilliant, and I'm delighted that the Borough Council has been able to play their part in putting this together. So the format for this afternoon's webinar is that I'm going to hand over to Hayley Smith and give her the floor for about 20 to 30 minutes so that she can talk about some of the support and help that is out there, so that she can talk about some of the things that she's been involved with and maybe give some examples as we go. That will leave us with a clear understanding of the best ways of accessing help and support in housing terms. And equally, after that, we will allow some time for questions. And if people want to put questions into the chat box, we can clearly ask questions from there. So all I'd say is settle back, grab your notepads and pens, and let's hand over to Hayley Smith. Thank you, Hayley.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'll just share screen.
We can see that, I should have said, Hayley, and if you want to go up to full screen or presentation mode or whatever you call it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so the purpose of today was really to raise awareness for the housing options service within Stafford Borough Council, and really talk about the role that we can all play in both preventing homelessness and ending rough sleeping. And I've noted from the title of the webinar today around preventing homelessness, it can sound like a very scary word. Homelessness is a very emotive word, and we're not here at all today to say that everybody that's going to be approaching warmer spaces or that will be accessing services will be at risk of homelessness or will be becoming homeless, but merely to sort of raise awareness around what might be the indicators that somebody may be struggling to keep a roof over their heads, that may be struggling to maintain rent payments and maybe reaching out for a bit of help and support. And yeah, so when we talk about homelessness, I don't think many people would have associated homelessness with rough sleeping, and you very much get the picture that I've just put on screen to associate with that. And really,
sorry to interrupt, Hayley. I've lost your presentation on screen. I don't know what's happened. Sorry. Perfect. We can see that now, and if you can go back up to full slide mode. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt you.
Can you still see that?
No, it's gone again.
Okay, I'll just keep the presentation on this because it can play around sometimes when doing that.
Thanks.
Okay. Yes, to be associated with rough sleeping, and really this is just the tip of the iceberg. And really what our services is around preventing people from falling into rough sleeping and looking at the much wider definition of homelessness. Those that might not have a legal right to occupy accommodation, or those that might be occupying accommodation that's not reasonable for them to continue to live in. And when we talk about rough sleeping being the tip of the iceberg, there's a diagram from Shelter, which is slightly outdated now, so I've put some updated figures next to the diagram, which really represents that rough sleeping is just the top of what we're looking at. And underneath that, we've got households who are in temporary accommodation. In the last year, that was just over 94,000 households in emergency accommodation. And then those that are at risk of homelessness, that are at risk of losing their homes. And last year there was nearly 300,000 homeless applications taken by local housing authorities throughout England. So what does it mean to be homeless or at risk of homelessness? The legal definition is that you don't have any legal right to reside in a property, or it is not reasonable for you to continue to occupy accommodation that is available. And examples of this might be people that are living with family and friends who've been asked to leave, those that have been served a formal written notice from their landlord, whether that's a private landlord or a social landlord, victims of domestic abuse or serious harassment, or those with medical needs, which means that they're no longer able to access their accommodation, as their accommodation is no longer reasonable for them to continue to occupy. So as a housing options service, we do respond to the needs of those that are at risk of homelessness and facing homelessness. As a local authority, we are required to provide advice and guidance to everybody, regardless of their housing status. And then within that, we've got certain duties and responsibilities depending on that individual's needs. And I've referred here to our Part 7 duties under homelessness and Part 6 under allocation of social housing, which I'll go into in a little bit more detail. But as a local authority, we also take on much wider roles that often sit outside our statutory function, such as tenancy related support. We have 2 support workers that go out and provide floating support to those that are either at risk of losing their home or just need a little bit of extra assistance to be able to maintain their homes. And also the work that we do around rough sleepers. As part of government's commitment to end rough sleeping by 2025, we've got a number of grant funded initiatives to provide specialist accommodation to rough sleepers. So the work that we do with regards to homelessness is also associated with the Homeless Reduction Act, which came into force in April 2018 and was the biggest change to homeless legislation in over 30 years. And the Homeless Reduction Act is the main piece of legislation that really tells us what duties that we have and how we are able to work with those that are either homeless or threatened with homelessness. And what the Act does is it really splits our duties into 2 separate categories. The first one is around prevention and the second one is around relief. The prevention duty for us is It's for anybody who is eligible for assistance and at risk of being homeless within 56 days. And an example of this is somebody whose landlord may have asked them to leave the property and may have served them with a notice. And this places a duty on the local authority to take reasonable steps to help that person to secure that accommodation does not cease to be available. So this is all about helping that person to remain in their current accommodation where it's safe and reasonable to do so that they do not become homeless and they do not have to move home. And every person that approaches who falls under this prevention duty will be provided with a personalised housing plan, which is advice and steps that the applicant has agreed to take and steps that the council have agreed to take to help to secure that that accommodation does not cease to be available. If you do ever work with anybody that does have a case that's open to either Stafford Borough Council or potentially any other local authority, it's always good to ask for a copy of that personalised housing plan so that you can see the advice that's been given and the steps that have been agreed to be taken. That duty will last for a total of 56 days, or it may come to an end for some other reasons. So, for example, if that accommodation is made available for a period of 6 months. So, for example, the Housing Options Service may be working with a landlord to secure that property and prevent that household from becoming homeless. So, for example, looking into the reasons why a notice may have been served and helping to put steps in place so that the landlord no longer feels that they need to act upon that notice. The other duty that we may owe to somebody who is homeless is the relief duty. And this is where somebody is already legally homeless. So this is no longer about preventing somebody from becoming homeless, but about crisis intervention to relieve that homelessness. And the criteria for this is that person must be eligible for assistance, homeless, and have a local connection to the local authority to which they are presenting. And this may be, for example, where a landlord has already served notice, has already gone to court and has obtained possession of that property. Or it may be that somebody's already approached us with a warrant of eviction has already been executed and they no longer have a legal right to occupy anywhere. There's no longer a roof over somebody's head. In this scenario, we have a duty to take reasonable steps to help that household to secure that suitable accommodation becomes available for at least 6 months. So this is about looking for alternative accommodation and making that available for the applicant. As the same with the prevention duty, the person will be given a personalised housing plan that will outline the steps that the applicant has agreed to take and that the council has agreed to take. And it's kind of important to note here that there's no duty to provide accommodation, but instead there is a power upon the local authority to provide accommodation as part of these reasonable steps. At this point of the relief duty, the onus is very much on the applicant to be taking steps to source alternative accommodation. This duty will last for a period of 56 days, or if that suitable accommodation is secured. After the 56 days, if the person is still homeless, then that's where we will look at things like priority need and intentionality. Very few cases get to this stage. Most cases are resolved and the homelessness is resolved at the prevention and the relief duty. At this point, if the main housing duty is owed, then there is a duty to secure emergency accommodation. And if during this time the household is in priority need, then we would look at what emergency accommodation provision would be available, and that can include being homeless at home. So there are some families that will choose to stay with relatives on an emergency basis whilst we look for a long-term accommodation. So with regards to the legislation, what does that look like in practice? So now that we've sort of covered the duties that are owed to the local authority, what does that look like on a day-to-day? And what can the applicants that are approaching the service and what can you expect to see from people who are approaching housing options? The first one is that we encourage early applications from households threatened with homelessness. So although the legislation does outline that the person must be homeless within 56 days, we really want to see people accessing the service as early as possible. It's much easier for us to resolve homelessness within the earlier timeframes than to have people approaching the service than crisis. At the moment, the majority of households do approach housing options at the crisis point, which places a lot of pressure both on the individuals that are coming through the service, the staff and the other agencies that are involved working with us. And one thing that we would really ask for our colleagues within Warmer Homes is to really encourage those early applications to come through. The next point is that we look at is we very much recognise that homelessness is a symptom and not a cause. What we really mean by that is that within homelessness, there's often a number of intrinsic support needs that are ongoing at any time, when a person's becoming homeless. It's very rarely just that somebody's lost the roof over their head. There's usually a number of other issues there that are underplaying that would need to be resolved in order to stop that person from falling back into the same situation again. And in order to do that, we work with a wide variety of agencies to address the causes of homelessness. And this can include health providers, social care, debt management, welfare benefits, domestic abuse charities, substance misuse and offender management, amongst many others. Often preventing homelessness isn't something that housing can do alone, and we work very closely with other agencies to be able to do this. And the other thing that you'll expect is that every person will be given a personalised housing plan with the reasonable steps to take that the household agrees to. And you'll see on the slides that I've used a diagram with regards to equality and equity. And there really is a recognition within homelessness that there will be some people that will need more support than others. There will be some people that will be able to take the steps outlined in the housing plan without very little support from the Housing Options Service or from any other service. Whilst there may be others, depending on the wider support needs, that will need a little bit of hand-holding throughout that process and a little bit more support. And within that, we do offer our tenancy sustainment officers to be able to do some outreach visits and help people to attend appointments. And we also work with our colleagues within social care and within mental health to be able to make sure that people have got the best opportunity to resolve their homelessness. When it comes to preventing homelessness, the things that you can kind of expect to see from the housing options team is that we liaise with landlords across all sectors to resolve tenancy issues. So when people come to us and they may have outstanding rent arrears, there may be examples of antisocial behaviour or poor property condition, the first thing that the team will do is to call the landlord and to have some discussions around what can be put in place to solve any problems that may have been going on with the tenancy. It's very common for us to mediate and negotiate between different parties. This can include relationship breakdowns, working with family and friends, people being asked to leave, in order to prevent homelessness where it's safe and reasonable to do so. And what we can do in those situations where we don't just want to be putting a plaster over any sort of problem that's been going on is that we can arrange a planned move through our allocation policy. This recognises that in the long term, that person will need their own accommodation, but they don't necessarily need to go down the homelessness process to do that. And along that process, we can offer tenancy support and work with other agencies to provide support to enable households to remain at home. And then with helping to secure alternative accommodation. So where it's not possible to prevent homelessness and we're looking at alternative accommodation, there's a few options that are available to us that you would see offered to those that are coming through the service. One of which is our private sector access scheme. We work with private sector landlords across the borough to provide financial incentives and support for those that are willing to offer tenancies at a local housing allowance rate to low-income households. We also work with supported accommodation providers to refer in for people that may be facing single homelessness. And we also work with other housing providers and social housing providers with nomination agreements and our allocation policy. With social housing, we don't just pick and choose who goes into what property, but it's all dictated through the allocation policy, which will say who's got a priority for a property depending on their housing need. Every housing association and every local authority will have their own allocation policy that they use to determine who is allocated what social housing. And in Stafford, our allocation policy very much sort of recognises those that are threatened with homelessness as having priority, and a number of others associated within that as well. So what can we all do to prevent homelessness? Now, we often have those from sort of the community sector will often approach us and ask, what can we do to help those that are facing homelessness? And sometimes there's some very, very simple things that have a massive benefit to the housing options team that really do help us in the day-to-day. And one of those is really just encouraging a person to speak with their landlord, speak with their family and friends as soon as they recognise that there's some problems that are starting to occur at home, whether that's that they're worried that they're going to be missing their first rent payment, or they can start to see that the relationships get intense at home. And often it's sometimes having the time to listen to that person's story, and are they confident in being able to retell that story to another agency, and really to reassure that support is available. All landlords have got a requirement to be speaking with their tenants around if they're struggling to pay their rent, And in particular with social landlords, there is a duty there, and there is a lot of support that's available. And there's various other webinars that have shown with support through citizens advice, especially that support is there. And what we can do as well is that we've got our self-assessment tool that's on our website that you can refer people into and support with a phone call or a visit to the council. So one of those things may be, do they have all their paperwork that they may need for the interview? Are they feeling comfortable in coming down to the council offices? Are they comfortable with having a phone call? They prefer something face-to-face and just having those open and honest conversations with the housing option officers from the start. So if you think that someone may be homeless or threatened with homelessness, there's a variety of different ways to get in contact with our service. The first one is that we have a self-assessment tool, which is going to be available 24 hours a day. And the best way to access that is by Googling housing at Stafford Borough Council, and it'll come up on the first page on our website. The self-assessment tool will ask a variety of questions to those that have got a housing need, and will then provide tailored advice and support and some signposting to different services depending on what that person's need is. If they're flagged as being homeless or threatened with homelessness, that form will be sent through to our housing options team, who will then make contact with that individual. And you can also refer into the service. So if it is that you know that the person's homeless and that it's not a self-assessment, but you want them to be able to seek advice straight away, then there is an online form by Googling Stafford Borough Council duty to refer that you can access and complete. We've also included our telephone number and a professional's number if you have any concern that somebody may be roofless that night or has an emergency housing situation, to be able to call through, along with our email address. Okay. So, are there any questions? Stop sharing screen.
Brilliant, thank you, Hayley. That's really interesting and really informative. Thank you so much. I've got a couple of questions because you always spark in my mind loads of questions, but I seem to think that you and your team supported more than 1,500 individuals last year through the work that you do, which is just a huge number. And thank you for everything you do in that respect. What would you say to those people who say, I've been to the council before and it's a difficult place to navigate? Can I bring someone with me just to help me through what could be a very difficult period? And just linked to that as well, what would you say to the people who say, well, I've been before and another council in another part of the country, and I did have a local connection, but I didn't really get any support or help. How would you persuade people that actually it's a good move to come and talk?
Yeah, absolutely. What I would say is that our officers absolutely recognise that just taking that first step through to the council offices is probably the most daunting thing that they're going to be doing to address their housing need. You're absolutely welcome to bring somebody with you for support during that interview. What we have on our website is our interview form that will go through some of the questions that you might be asked at the interview and some of the things you can do beforehand to prep for that if you are feeling nervous about coming down to the council building. But I would absolutely encourage you to do so, and very welcome to bring any friends, family, or anybody else to support you in that.
Thank you. That's really reassuring. And I liked earlier when you talked about homelessness being the symptom, not the cause, and the work you do with other partners to help support people to get to a sustainable place, sustainable accommodation. So thank you. Let me just ask a couple of other questions, if I can. If someone is homeless that evening, what do you advise that they do? What do you do if they don't want to talk to the housing team? And what advice have you got there?
So the first point is we'd absolutely encourage that you do refer into the housing options team. If they feel that they're not in a comfortable position to be able to do that, then you can absolutely call on their behalf. A lot of the time we can do the housing options interviews over the phone, and we often pass messages through as long as you've got that person's consent to be able to do so, so that we can try and resolve that situation as early as possible.
Yeah, and I know some of our partners in some of the warm spaces, or certainly in the voluntary sector, already do support us by pulling together some of the forms and background information that individuals need, and that's really welcome because it just helps get faster forward, doesn't it? So, just on the same vein, if you saw a rough sleeper, what would you advise?
So you can refer rough sleepers through to housing options via the Street Link referral. Again, if you Google Stafford Borough Council rough sleeper or Stafford Borough Council Street Link, both of those will take you directly through to our website. And what the Street Link referral will do, will ask you some details around the individual. You can geotag a location, and at the earliest availability, one of our officers will be able to go out and speak with that person and try and offer them some suitable solutions.
That's brilliant. Is it ever too early to refer someone into your team, Hayley?
If you've got somebody that's expressing to you that they're worried about losing their home, that they don't feel that they're going to make that next month's payment, then it's always good to try and refer into the team.
And I seem to think that you suggested that for emergencies, because obviously there's only a certain number of hours that the team are available or in offices, but these things often happen when you least expect them, Friday nights or sort of over the weekend. Is there a way of getting help and support, or at least having a conversation? What have you got?
Yes, we do run an out of hours service. So our service is 24/7, 365 days a year. And the number for that is 01785 619 170. That's 619 170. And that'll take you through to the officer on call, who will go through a housing needs assessment and see if any emergency provisions required that night.
That's really reassuring, because if I was in that position, I'd want to be at least trying to get some support. So, and if I was a volunteer, I'd want to be doing the same for those people. So, thank you for that. What about just sort of moving off the sort of the more imminent stuff? Can you help someone find housing when they already have high levels of rent arrears?
Yes, of course. So a lot of the housing providers that we work with, they will look for a previous landlord reference. And obviously rent arrears is something that will come up. And what landlords want to say is that there's repayment plans in place. People acknowledge that rent arrears do happen, that people will face financial difficulties. But really what the key is what we're doing about that. And usually if there's a rent repayment plan in place that's been stuck to for usually a period of around 3 to 6 months, then the housing providers will look to consider, because they can see that commitment to repaying those arrears. So for anybody that is looking for rehousing that has got high level of rent arrears, it's really important to take that first contact that previous landlord or your current landlord and set up a repayment plan, even if it's just small amounts each week.
That's really good advice, and we can all get into to those situations, can't we? And actually being upfront and trying to find a long-term solution. So within your team, Hayley, how regularly are you meeting with some of the other people within the voluntary sector and with the public sector? Sort of with mental health and with social services, those sorts of people get the right support. Because often the support isn't within your team, is it? So how easy is it to knit that together into something that works for the individual?
Yeah, I think a daily basis, if we're being honest. I think on a day-to-day, the housing option officers who are working on these cases will be speaking with the relevant agencies, but we all come together at least once a week to be able to look at how we can coordinate the support packages to provide the best service that we can.
So in summary, it sounds like you're here to support nearly all the time then.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've come to the end of the questions we've got, but obviously, Hayley, I think you would be open for anyone to have a conversation if there was someone that an individual was concerned about. And I think your overriding message is come and talk to us, and the earlier the better, to try and help find lasting, sustainable solutions for anyone who is concerned about paying this week's rent, or alternatively about housing longer term as well. Have I read that correctly?
Yes, absolutely. And if there are sort of any community organisations that are listening in that feel that they want to know a little bit more about housing, they're always welcome to get in contact. We have run training sessions where we've had voluntary and community groups attending. I'm very happy to take that forward if there's any specific interest around homelessness within these groups.
And that's a really positive end and a really strong message. Hayley, you couldn't have been any clearer. So really appreciate all the work that you and your team do. And thank you for this afternoon's brief expose to some of the really valuable work that you do for many vulnerable people within our communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you.